In the autumn of 1889, the Cane Hollow State Asylum admitted 42 patients into its east wing. By the winter of 1891, that wing did not exist. The doorway had been bricked over. The windows had been sealed from the outside with cast iron plates bolted into the stone. The corridor that once led to it ended in a wall of new masonry that did not match anything else in the building. And when the state inspector arrived the following spring and asked the superintendent what had happened to the east wing, the superintendent handed him a ledger, pointed to a line that read "discharged," and told him the wing had been closed for repairs. 42 names, all discharged on the same day, all to the same address, an address that, when the inspector later checked, did not exist. What actually happened inside those walls between the autumn of 1889 and the winter of 1891 is one of the darkest chapters in the history of American institutional care. And the reason you have never heard of it is not because it was forgotten, it is because someone made sure it was buried. Literally. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I'm about to tell you gets significantly darker. And I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of what was removed from the Cane Hollow record, the 42 names the state tried to erase, the superintendent's own private correspondence in his own handwriting, and the county coroner's suppressed report from the spring of 1892, I put it all into a written document. It's linked below and the QR code is on your screen. Now let's continue. To understand what happened at Cane Hollow, you first have to understand what the asylum was supposed to be. It was commissioned in 1874 by the state legislature as part of a national reform movement that had been building since the middle of the century. Advocates like Dorothea Dix had spent decades touring the country and documenting the conditions in which the mentally ill were being kept, chained in unheated barns, locked in the cellars of poorhouses, left in jails with violent criminals. Dix and the reformers argued that this was not only cruel but medically counterproductive, and by the 1870s most state legislatures had come to agree with her. Cane Hollow was one of the last of these reform-era asylums to be commissioned. The idea was progressive for its time. Instead of chaining the mentally ill in poorhouses or jails, the state would build a proper facility, fresh air, sunlight, open ground, working farms where patients could be given light labor as part of their treatment, a place of healing rather than confinement. The site chosen was a valley in the western part of the state, remote enough to provide quiet, close enough to a rail line to allow supplies and staff. The valley itself had been settled briefly in the 1840s by a small farming community, but the community had dispersed after a series of poor harvests in the following decade, and by the time the state surveyors arrived in 1875, the land was mostly empty. The few remaining farmers were bought out at generous prices, and construction began the following year. It took nearly 8 years. The main building was completed in 1882. It was, by every account of the period, a beautiful structure. 4 stories of dressed stone quarried from the ridge to the north of the valley. A central rotunda topped with a copper dome that could be seen from the rail line 3 miles to the south. 2 long wings extending east and west from the central administrative block. The west wing housed women. The east wing housed men. Between them, in the rotunda, was the superintendent's residence, the staff quarters, the treatment rooms, and a small chapel with a stained glass window that had been shipped in pieces from a workshop in Boston. The grounds included a working dairy, a vegetable garden, an orchard of apple trees, and a small cemetery on the far side of the ridge for patients whose families did not claim their remains. The first superintendent was Dr. Elias Pruitt. He was 38 when he took the position. He had trained at a medical college in Philadelphia, spent 6 years at an asylum in Massachusetts, and came to Cane Hollow with strong recommendations and what the trustees described as a modern approach to the treatment of nervous diseases. His salary was substantial for the period. He was, by every visible measure, a rising figure in American psychiatry. For the first several years, by all accounts, the asylum functioned as intended. Patient records from that period survive in the state archive. They show admissions, treatments, discharges, and occasional deaths, all documented in a clear and consistent hand. Patients were treated with what the period called moral therapy, which meant regular routines, useful work, exposure to nature, and, when necessary, mild sedation. Death rates were within normal ranges for the period. Discharge rates were, by the standards of the time, unusually high. Cane Hollow, in its first 7 years, appeared to be a genuine success. There is nothing unusual in the records from 1882 through the middle of 1889, and then the records change. Beginning in September of 1889, the East Wing ledger begins to show a different pattern. Admissions increase sharply. Between September and December of that year, 42 men were admitted to the East Wing. That number by itself is not extraordinary. Asylums of that period regularly admitted large groups. What is extraordinary is where they came from. The admission records list towns and counties, but when researchers in the 1970s attempted to cross-reference those origins with census data and local records, they found that many of the towns listed either did not exist or had populations too small to have generated a patient. One admission lists a man arriving from a town of 17 people. Another lists 3 separate men, all admitted on the same day, all from the same address in a county that had no formal address system at the time. The names themselves are also unusual. Several appear to be phonetic approximations rather than proper names. Others are clearly false, the sort of name a bored clerk invents when asked to fill in a form. What this suggests, and what later investigators would come to believe, is that the 42 men admitted to the East Wing in the autumn of 1889 were not admitted through any normal process. They were brought there, and someone at Cane Hollow was falsifying the paperwork to make it look otherwise. The question is, who brought them, and why? The answer begins to emerge in a set of letters that were discovered in 1962 when the building was being surveyed for demolition. The letters were found in a small locked cabinet in what had been the superintendent's office. The cabinet had been overlooked in the initial evacuation of the building in 1961. It was found behind a panel of wood that had come loose during the survey, and inside it were a bound ledger, several loose sheets of correspondence, and a small brass key whose purpose has never been identified. The correspondence was between Dr. Pruitt and a man in the state capital named Colonel Henry Vance. Vance was a former military surgeon who had served in the Civil War and had, in the years after, become involved in a series of medical societies and private research groups. He had money, considerable money, some of it inherited and some of it made through investments in railroads and mining. He had also, according to the few surviving accounts of him, developed by the 1880s, an intense interest in what the period called experimental medicine. This was a broad and largely unregulated field. It included legitimate researchers working in university laboratories. It also included men working entirely outside of any professional oversight, funded by their own money, accountable to no one. The letters are not entirely clear. They use coded language in places, and several pages appear to have been deliberately burned. Corners are missing. Whole paragraphs are struck through with heavy ink. But the outline of what they describe is this. Vance and a small group of associates had been conducting research into what they called deep constitutional disorders. They believed, and their letters make this explicit, that certain mental conditions were caused by structural defects in the brain that could not be observed in living patients. Their theory was that these defects could only be verified through direct examination of tissue. And direct examination of tissue, in the medicine of the 1880s, meant one of two things. Either you waited for the patient to die of natural causes, which could take decades and would give you tissue that had been altered by whatever caused the death, or you obtained the tissue by other means. Vance's letters do not describe those other means directly, but they describe the requirements. To advance their research, they needed access to a large number of subjects, all of whom would need to remain at the facility indefinitely, and none of whom could have families likely to inquire after them. Cane Hollow, Vance wrote in a letter dated August of 1889, offered a unique opportunity. The valley was remote, the oversight was minimal, the superintendent was ambitious, and Dr. Pruitt, for reasons that the letters never fully explain but that seem to involve a combination of professional ambition, financial payment, and what one of Vance's later letters describes as a shared understanding of scientific necessity, agreed to provide it. The 42 men arrived over the course of 3 months. Before we move on to what happened after they arrived, stop for a second. What you just heard about the letters between Pruitt and Vance is the part that changes everything, but it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original correspondence. The coded phrases, the burned pages, it's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back, because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. What happened inside the East Wing between the autumn of 1889 and the winter of 1891 can only be partially reconstructed. The direct records were destroyed, but 3 separate sources give us pieces of the picture. The first is a diary kept by a night orderly named Silas Bragg. Bragg worked at Cane Hollow for 11 months, from October of 1889 to September of 1890, when he left the position abruptly. His diary was found in his family's possession in 1983 and donated to a regional historical society. The entries are short and often difficult to read, but they describe things that no orderly at a properly functioning asylum should ever have had to describe. Patients being taken from their rooms at night to a treatment room on the 2nd floor. Sounds from that treatment room that Bragg would not name in writing. Patients returning who could no longer walk, could no longer speak, or in some cases did not return at all. Bragg records, in an entry dated March of 1890, that he had counted the men in the East Wing that morning, and there were now 31. He had counted them the previous week, and there had been 36. Nobody had been discharged. Nobody had been officially recorded as having died, but 5 men were gone. The second source is the testimony of a laundress named Cora Mullen, who worked at the asylum for 2 years and who gave a signed statement to a county investigator in the autumn of 1892. Mullen described washing sheets that came from the East Wing. She said the sheets often had material on them that she did not recognize as blood but that she could not clean out. She described the smell of the East Wing corridor. She described the fact that after a certain point in the spring of 1890, laundry from the East Wing stopped coming to the main laundry entirely. It was being handled somewhere else, by someone else. She did not know where or by whom. The third source is the most disturbing. In the summer of 1891, a farmer whose land bordered the asylum's eastern grounds reported to the county sheriff that something was wrong with a section of his pasture. The grass was dying in long strips. The strips ran parallel to the asylum wall, and when he dug a test hole, he struck what he believed to be human bone at a depth of less than 3 feet. The sheriff came, examined the site, and then, according to the surviving report, left without taking further action. There is no follow-up. There is no investigation. The farmer's report exists in the county records, and then the trail simply stops. The farmer himself sold his land the following year and moved out of state. His name does not appear in any subsequent census for that county. By the autumn of 1891, Dr. Pruitt appears to have understood that whatever had been happening in the East Wing could no longer continue. The exact trigger is not known. It may have been Bragg's departure. It may have been the farmer's report. It may have been that Vance and his associates had simply completed whatever they came to do. But in October of 1891, a construction crew arrived at Cane Hollow. They were not local men. They were brought in from out of state, housed on the grounds in temporary quarters, and paid, according to the asylum's financial records, an unusually high wage. Over the course of 6 weeks, they did 3 things. They bricked over the doorway that led from the central rotunda into the East Wing corridor. They bolted iron plates over every window on the East Wing's ground floor and 2nd floor. And they extended the corridor's stone facade to make the sealed doorway blend into the wall, as though the wing had never been connected to the main building at all. The men who did the bricking were, by every account, not aware of what was happening on the other side of the wall, because the East Wing was not empty when they sealed it. This is the part of the Cane Hollow story that has to be stated plainly, because it is the part that most people, when they first encounter it, refuse to believe. The ledger discharge that Pruitt showed the state inspector the following spring, the one that recorded all 42 men as having been sent to a non-existent address, was dated October of 1891. That is the same month the bricking began. But the last confirmed sighting of a living patient inside the East Wing, based on the delivery of food from the asylum kitchen, is dated November of 1891, 6 weeks after the discharge date. 3 weeks into the bricking, there are kitchen records, in a hand that is not Pruitt's, that log the delivery of meals to the East Wing during the bricking process. Not many meals, not enough for 42 men, but enough for some. The kitchen records stop in the second week of December 1891. The bricking was completed on December 19th of that year. What happened to the men who were still inside on December 19th is not recorded anywhere, but they were not on any subsequent census. They were not admitted to any other institution. Their names, the phonetic approximations, and the invented ones do not appear in any death record in the state. They simply stop. The state inspector's visit in the spring of 1892 was, by every indication, a formality. Pruitt showed him the ledger. Pruitt showed him the newly finished stone facade where the East Wing corridor used to be. Pruitt told him the wing had been closed for repairs. The inspector wrote a brief report, filed it with the state board, and left. Pruitt continued to serve as superintendent of Cane Hollow for another 9 years. He retired in 1900, moved to a coastal city, and lived quietly on a comfortable pension until his death in 1917. Colonel Vance died earlier, in 1908, and his papers were, according to his will, burned by his executor. Whatever research the two of them had conducted, whatever findings they had produced, whatever they had believed they were learning from the men in the East Wing, none of it was ever published. None of it survives. The research, if there ever was any real research, died with them. The East Wing itself remained sealed for the next 70 years. Cane Hollow State Asylum was decommissioned in 1961. Its patient population had been dwindling for years as newer facilities absorbed the caseload and as the general shift in American mental health care moved toward outpatient treatment and pharmaceutical intervention. By the time it closed, the asylum housed fewer than 50 patients in a building designed for 400. The main building sat empty for another decade before the state decided to demolish it. There had been proposals during the 1960s to convert it into a training facility, a state records archive, or a museum, but each proposal ran into the same obstacle. Cane Hollow had a reputation, not a specific one, not something anyone could point to, but everyone who worked on the proposals came back saying the same thing. The building did not feel right. The valley did not feel right. And when a routine engineering survey in 1971 found that the East Wing was structurally unsound in ways the original blueprints could not account for, the state decided to demolish the entire structure rather than repair it. The demolition began in the summer of 1972 with the West Wing, which was taken down in a standard controlled manner. The central rotunda came down in the autumn, and then, in November of 1972, the demolition crew began work on the East Wing. They opened the sealed doorway, they removed the iron plates from the windows, and they went inside. What they found, they never described publicly. The state issued a brief statement 3 weeks later, saying that the demolition of Cane Hollow was complete and that the site would be returned to open land. The demolition foreman, a man named Alden Rees, gave one interview to a local newspaper in 1974, in which he said only that the East Wing had contained material of a nature that made further comment inappropriate. Rees died in 1981. His notes and photographs from the demolition, if they ever existed, have never surfaced. The site where Cane Hollow stood is now a low, grassy field. There is no marker, there is no plaque. The valley is quiet, and in the summer the grass grows tall, and unless you knew what had been there, you would drive past it without ever slowing down. But if you did know, and if you walked to the eastern edge of the field, you would find that in one long strip, running parallel to where the wall used to be, the grass does not grow the same as it does elsewhere. It comes in a slightly different colour. It dies earlier in the autumn, and nobody, in the 50 years since the demolition, has ever been able to explain why. 42 men were admitted to Cane Hollow State Asylum in the autumn of 1889. 42 men were discharged, on paper, in October of 1891. Not one of them was ever seen again. The wing they lived in was sealed with them still inside it, and the men who sealed it did not know they were doing it, and the man who ordered it done died a wealthy and respected citizen. And somewhere beneath a quiet grassy field in a valley in the western part of the state, whatever remains of them is still there, waiting for someone to remember they existed at all.